Thank you. Thanks, Laura, and thanks to the Tallgrass Prairie Center and the Friends of the Tallgrass Prairie Center, and thanks to all you folks for coming out on what should be a nice spring day, but is not. So, but we'll get there, believe me, one way or the other. So, as Laura mentioned, I work for the Land Stewardship Project, and we all have parts of our jobs that are not very nice and kind of crappy and kind of a pain in the butt. But I have one part of my job that's really cool, is that we have always believed in one way to get the word out about alternatives in agriculture, and some of these innovations in regenerative agriculture is to tell stories. So a big part of my job is I get to go around the Midwest and interview farmers who are doing some of these innovative things, as well as the scientists, ecologists, natural resource professionals, other folks that they're working with and teaming up with. And so after working with Laura and Dana on the Farm as a Natural Habitat, I had thought about doing a book that would focus, that book covered kind of the gamut of this idea of kind of breaking down the barriers between the agronomic and the ecological in farming. I wanted to do a book that would focus more on just kind of highlighting some of the individual farmers out there and some of the things that they're doing. I really feel that they deserve to have their stories told and kind of more in a permanent way. So that was kind of the impetus behind that. And I'm just going to introduce you to a few of the farmers that I wrote about and tell just a little bit of their stories. And then I'm going to kind of flow into a little bit of some of the farmers who might be of more interest to this crowd, in that how they've used integrating tallgrass prairie ecosystems into their farming operations in various ways, and how that might, I think it provides a model for some of the ways that we can kind of break down that barrier between the wild and the domesticated on some of these farms, and really make them a working landscape, which is talked about a lot, but these are kind of what I would call working ecosystems landscapes kind of things. So see if I can figure out the clicker. See, it is on. Do I point it?
You can point it at the screen.
Or I can, let's see.
Let's see. First
Oh,
of all, that is on.
that's
so
that's the.
You got the little drive plugged into the side of the computer.
Oh, I see.
A little dunkel. Is that what it's called?
That's what, maybe.
There it is right there.
Okay.
All right. It may take a while to.
There we go. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So I'm glad to see Aldo Leopold here, and it sounds like you're going to have, is it Terry Tempest Williams? Wow, that's great. So a real, I guess, motivation and inspiration for this book was Aldo Leopold for me. I was introduced to his writings when I was growing up on a farm in southwest Iowa by a neighboring farmer who handed me this book and said, "You might be interested in this. It kind of talks about the seasons, goes through the seasons, and then kind of connects it to a bigger picture." And so I picked it up mostly because I liked the illustrations in it. I think they were done by Charles Schwartz or something. But then I ended up really getting into the Sand County Almanac, and it really had a big influence on me. And I really like this quote from him, because it's something that a lot of these farmers I write about really personify, which is this idea that often I think conservation can be connected with something maybe almost negative, or it's something you have to deny yourself, you have to maybe restrict yourself. But these farmers are taking a very proactive approach, and they're really going out there, and it is a positive exercise of skill, and they're very creative. They're really going out there and really looking at some challenges, and not just saying, well, this is a big barrier, it's something that I can't deal with, but really trying to work with nature and with ecosystems in a way that they can overcome these challenges. And I really see them as being very creative. Many of them maybe never even heard of Aldo Leopold, or certainly didn't read Sand County Almanac or anything like that, but they really are kind of practicing that land ethic, which is where I got the subtitle of the book. The title of the book, Wildly Successful Farming, comes from a friend of mine, Tex Hawkins, who was for many years a fish and wildlife biologist on the upper Mississippi, and his father was one of Aldo Leopold's first graduate students, Art Sr., and Tex used to go around on farms with me through a project called the Monitoring Project, where we were looking at different ways that farms were monitoring sustainability, and he would often say, this farm is wildly successful. You know, he says, I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's got this going on and that going on. And so that always stuck with me. And I always joke that I stole the title from him, but I gave him a free copy of the book, so hopefully. So the other inspiration for this, and the person who kind of started me on this journey of really trying to tell these stories through farmers, is Dan Specht, he's the guy in the front of the picture, and that's him with Jeff Kling. Dan, unfortunately, was killed in a haying accident a few years ago, but Jeff is still up in the McGregor area. They farmed just above the Mississippi River there. And Dan's an example of someone who has always, actually he has a degree in biology from UNI here. He went back to college after he'd started farming. But he was always someone who never broke down the connections. He always made a connection between the farm and the ecosystem. And the reason this was way back in the 1990s, I had gone down to interview Dan because I wanted to do an article on the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And he taught me a really important lesson. He was actually pretty knowledgeable about the dead zone because he had been invited down there by a fishing group to observe what was going on with fertilizer runoff and what impact it was having on the fishing industry down there. And he was also a pioneer in getting like the Practical Farmers of Iowa started in this state, and had done a lot of work on his own farm and reducing nutrient runoff, that type of thing. So I thought, well, he'd be a good way to tell this story about how can we reduce the dead zone in the Gulf. And I called him up and he said, yeah, you know, we can go around and I can show you some of the stuff I'm doing on my farm, but on one condition, we go fishing that night on the Mississippi. And I'm like, well, that's a waste of time. I don't want to go fishing. I just want to get the story and then get back. But by the end of the very long day, I had realized he really had showed me that what goes on that land, on that farm, and what goes on that river were really connected. And the fishing trip was just as much a part of him teaching me what was going on as far as making those connections. And he was one of these kind of people who, he was a pretty shy guy and he didn't have much to say, but when he started talking about things like water cycles and nutrient cycles and the connections between plant systems and livestock systems, you could really learn a lot in a short period of time. So these are some other farmers that I write about who I really think make that connection, and it's Martin and Loretta Jouse, and they have an organic dairy operation in west central Minnesota. And I'll just let you read that quote. I won't read it to you. But this really kind of gets at what their attitude is and their philosophy toward the land is. They have an interesting background. They both have degrees in wildlife biology, and Martin had grown up on that farm, and they had met while working on a wildlife refuge in Illinois, but ended up coming back to the farm, and they have never lost their love of wildlife. So they decided if they were going to come back and farm, they were going to some way make that farm the home to as much wildlife as they could. And it's in the middle of corn and soybean country in west central Minnesota. But they've done one thing. The first thing you'll notice when you go to the farm is they've restored 11 acres of wetland, which is great, and it's home to a lot of wildlife. But what really excites me about what they're doing, and what a lot of these kind of ecological agrarians I talk about are doing, is that they have integrated the working aspects of their farm with these more natural wild areas. And an example is they have a rotational grazing system. They have set up wildlife plantings around each of these paddocks, and these wildlife plantings serve as homes for beneficial birds and insects that feed on the insects that are damaging to their crops, that type of thing. They also, of course, reduce erosion. They do a lot of cover cropping to build their soil health. They do really diverse rotations, and their rotational grazing system is done in such a way that they'll have rest areas where grassland songbirds can nest, that type of thing. So it's that idea that where they really do integrate the working, they don't separate the working aspect of the farm from what we might consider the non-working. To them, it's all part of a piece. And I think the other thing that Martin and Loretta really strikes me, and I see with a lot of these farmers, is they are very willing to team up with people that maybe farmers often would not be associated with. For example, they'll host Audubon Society tours. They'll work with ecologists to try to figure out, to kind of do some monitoring on their farm, that type of thing. And they really are seeing results. I mean, they really do gauge the success. One of the things Martin often says is, if I don't hear certain birds every morning when I wake up, then I consider myself a failure. I really want to hear those. They band birds. They have a license to band birds, and they've banded over 200 species of birds on their farm. It's really quite a place. So this is Jan Libby and Tim Landgraf. They farm near Mason City, and they have a CSA, One Step at a Time Gardens. And they are, again, in the middle of corn and soybean country, and they had originally bought this land because they just wanted a little piece of property out in the country. But they decided maybe they needed to be a little bit more proactive, and in the long term, if they wanted to keep this farm kind of in a natural type habitat, they had to figure out a way to make a living on it. So they set up this CSA, and they have, again, integrated wildlife habitat into aspects of it. You can kind of see back behind Tim there, that's a state wildlife refuge that's right across the road from them. So what's great about this is a good example, and I saw with a lot of these farms, is they can kind of help extend the environmental benefits you get on public lands onto private lands, because they're seeing wildlife and other benefits, water quality benefits on their private land that the public is paying for on that public land across the road. So it's a way to extend that across those borders and really make it a real community asset. You know, the one kind of issue or one concern you might have with some of these farms is the same with the jousts, is that they are, since they are surrounded by a monoculture of corn and beans, how, you know, does the benefit stop at their border? And so, you know, the ideal would be to see more of these farms who are kind of connected in some way to get more of those benefits across the landscape. So this is Tex Hawkins, the guy who I stole the title of the book from right here. And this is Marge and Jack Worthison. And this is an example that I write about in the book. This is the classic driftless geography that you see in southeast Minnesota, northeast Iowa, and Illinois, southwest Wisconsin. This is actually in southeast Minnesota. Marge and Jack are the example of farmers who have fit the way they farm with the landscape. And we've seen examples of what happens when you don't fit the farm to the landscape, especially in the driftless, where you see horrific erosion. Not too far from where they farm is a town that's kind of infamous in soil erosion history. It's the town of Beaver, and there was a book written about it called The Town That Erosion Destroyed. And it's a town that in the 20s and 30s, the farms around there stripped the hillsides of trees, plowed up and down, and the erosion was so horrific that they had to actually move bridges several times to keep above the silt line. Finally, the government said, we're tired of doing this, and they just bought everybody out and moved them out, and the only thing left now is a cemetery in that area. Marge and Jack they have a profitable farm. They're making a living. They're raising a family on this operation, but they have fit their farm into the landscape rather than forcing their way upon it, and it's really something to see. It's I don't know how to. It's like every time the farm itself is, in total they're farming about 260 acres, but every time you turn around, there's a new little aspect to it, because that driftless, you know, country has got all these little valleys and folds in there, and they figured out a way. Well, we can't crop this, so we'll do rotational grazing here. We'll put in wildlife planting here that will provide pollinator habitat for the gardens that they have, because they also have a CSA. They maybe raise sheep on some other rougher ground, but they have figured out a way to kind of fit their farm into that landscape in a sustainable manner. And it's really, one of the things that really struck me was that they are able to do this in a way that you really feel like every time because they have had to fit it in with these little wildlife plantings and these little hedgerows here and there, the farm just seems much bigger than it is. It seems much bigger than 260 acres. This picture was taken, Tex, I had followed Tex and Marge and Jack around all day, and Tex kind of explained what he saw going on through the eyes of a wildlife biologist, which was really fun to see. So this is Phil Speck, Dan Speck's brother, and Mary Dom, she's a prairie ecologist, and Phil. So after Dan was killed, Mary bought his farm, and it's very near Phil's farm here. And Phil has got a dairy operation. He actually just recently sold his milking herd, and he's raising replacement heifers. But they're doing a really interesting project together now where they're trying to figure out the connection between the growth of the grass, both on the kind of domesticated pastures that they have on these farms, as well as some restored prairie that Dan had restored, 10 acres of prairie, and the presence of bobolinks. And Phil is actually a really interesting guy. He reads scientific journals as a hobby and really knows how to set up actually research projects on his own. But they're trying to figure out what's that connection, and they're doing everything from doing these really sophisticated soil health tests called the Haney tests to look at soil organic matter and the life in the soil, and doing doing plant clippings and looking at the density of the plant species, and then looking at how many bobolinks are nesting off of this land. And Phil's goal is to someday use bobolinks as kind of an indicator of the health of that land. And it's always dangerous to focus on one species, but bobolinks are an interesting bird in that they're what they call an obligate species. They have to have grass. And I think I was talking to Laura earlier, we were doing a podcast interview, and she said something that really struck me, which is when that bird decides it's going to land in that pasture, it may not be a prairie the way we consider it a prairie, but the bird thinks it's a prairie, and that may be good enough in some ways. I'm kind of paraphrasing what you said. But I think that's kind of what they're getting at here is this isn't going to be a perfect prairie ecosystem like we once had here, but they're mimicking a lot of the ideals from it, which is diversity and really trying to work with nature instead of against nature. And Phil's goal is someday if they could come up with, say, a beef label called bobolink beef or something that would have a little bobolink on it, the consumer would support that. If you like birds, if you like seeing birds, and if you like seeing perennial habitat, you would buy that product because it's good for that bird. And this is Paul Scrady, he's a ornithologist up at Upper Iowa University who spent some time on their farm looking at what they're doing. And he really, I like this quote because he talks about working landscape, but it's in a different way than maybe we think of working in a landscape. It's again that idea, it's a working ecosystem landscape. So that even if it's not producing the maximum production, it is producing something. It's producing ecosystem services. And this is just getting again at this idea that Phil was really looking for this indicator, and he sees really bobolinks as one way to do that. So this is Martin, and this is Martin Joust that I introduced to you before, and he, I guess he kind of personifies what a lot of these farmers and it goes back a little bit to what Phil and Mary are looking for, which is this way of measuring success that maybe not your typical farmer the way they would measure it, through corn and soybean production. Now these people have to make a living, and they have to pay their taxes, and they want to, have to feed their families and all of that. So they have to make money, and they are, but they still are, their gauge of success is a little bit on a scale, and number one on the scale is what impact am I having on that ecosystem? And they feel if they can take care of that, then the other things will fall into place. One section of the book that kind of got me the most excited were these group of people who are younger and who went to college and got degrees or some kind of academic training in either restoration ecology, wildlife biology, you name it, something related to the environment, with the idea that they were going to go work for a natural resource agency or an environmental organization, or maybe go into academics and teach other ecologists. That was the way that they were going to have a positive impact on the land. And these people, somewhere along the line, got off the rails and ended up going into farming, which when I was growing up and when I was studying journalism and wildlife biology at Iowa State, farming and healthy ecosystems did not live in the same room. They were two ships passing in the night. So I think this is a sign that I've seen a lot of advancements in regenerative agriculture, and we've seen a lot of kind of opening up of views of the role that agriculture can play in a positive way in the environment. And so it's Brian Simon, he has a master's degree in wildlife biology, and Jesse, his wife, has an environmental education degree. But Brian says he went to University of Minnesota at Morris, and he went back there recently and told his biology professor he was farming, and the biology professor was like, oh. He was not pleased. But he says, no, you got to know what I'm doing. And what he is doing is they have restored prairie on a farm there, and there's a wetland behind them there and a lake ecosystem. They've restored open prairie as well as an oak savanna, and they're raising grass-fed beef and sheep on this operation. And that was all corn and beans before they came in, and it's working out really well for them. So this is another one of these examples of somebody who decided that their way they're going to have an positive impact on the land is through farming. This is Peter Allen, who farms in southwest Wisconsin in Vernon County near Viola. And he had a environmental science degree from Indiana University, and then he got his master's in restoration ecology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then he was well on his way to getting his PhD in restoration ecology. And he went to a farm where they were doing perennial polycultures, which is this idea that you are using trees and other perennials and grazing livestock in there, and kind of doing this integrated system. And he became convinced that this was the way he could have a positive impact on the land. And he thought he was going to, do the academic tract and teach restoration ecology. He quit the program, cold turkey, upset a lot of people, but he got some friends together. They bought a really rough piece of land in southwest Wisconsin, and he's in the process of restoring that through removing invasive species and grazing and some selective cutting and plantings, and trying to recreate an oak savanna habitat. They've got a meat CSA. People who like this kind of habitat and want to see more of this oak savanna habitat belong to this community-supported ag marketing model they have, and in return get I think they raise beef, sheep, and goat, actually, and some pigs. So this is Tyler Carlson, and he's another one of these people who got a restoration ecology degree. I think he has a master's from the U of M, but then decided the way he was going to have a positive impact was, again, he was interested in restoring this oak savanna habitat that we had so much of here at one time. He's an interesting example because when I went to his farm, he, in this first picture here, this is an example of the farm had pasture, open pasture, and fields, corn and soybean fields, and it had this existing woodland in the farm. So one of the things he wanted to do was what they call alley grazing, which is you go in, you plant trees in rows, and you put fences up and then until they get big enough that you can graze cattle in between them. And it can be a way to, in the short term, get economic benefit from that land through grazing, through selling grass-fed beef or whatever. And then in the long term, when those trees are mature enough, you can start doing selective cutting. So it's a great idea. Climate scientists really are excited about this. It's called silvopasturing because you can get short-term cycling of carbon and greenhouse gases through the grass and the grazing, but you can get long-term cycling through the trees. So it's really, everybody gets really excited about it. He hosts a lot of field days on it and all that. I visited his farm when he was first getting it started, and then I went back 6 years later, and it was real hit and miss. And what he found was when you plant trees in an open field, gophers will go in and chew every one of those roots. So he was still going to try to give it a shot, and he was working somewhat. You can see some trees in the background there. But what was really working was he had went into the existing woodland that had been invaded by buckthorn and some other invasives, had cleared them out, and then had brought in the cattle to keep those invasives down. And that was really coming along as a thriving oak savanna habitat. And what it really kind of became clear to him was it's this example of where you really have to realize nature bats last, and it's going to kick you in the butt. And sometimes you have to step back and realize you don't know it all. And what he had realized was sometimes trying to kind of put nature in a domesticated setting didn't work out so well, but kind of bringing a domesticated practice into nature can sometimes work. You have to be very flexible. If he was just raising corn and beans and he was stuck in that system or in another system that was much more restrictive, he wouldn't have had that flexibility to, I think, kind of pivot on that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about an area that I write about in the book that I think is one of the more exciting aspects of this wildly successful model, which is soil health. And there's a lot of excitement around soil health, and the reason I find this really exciting is, I'll be frank, a lot of these farmers that I'm writing about are not farming thousands of acres. They're often a couple hundred acres if it's a vegetable operation, maybe 5 acres. They're not covering the landscape in these practices. But I feel like I'm seeing examples of where they could serve a real role in helping us scale up some of these positive benefits we can get from wildly successful farming. And the example I see it in is through the soil health movement. And I don't know, folks may be familiar with this. There is a lot of interest right now in soil health, in cover cropping. And one of the reasons that there is so much interest right now is one of the most cutting edge conservation methods that we had for many years, and it still is a good system, it has saved a lot of soil, is no-till agriculture. We're starting to see some of the shortcomings of that system. Partly it's because of climate change. The climate has changed and these systems can't stand up to that system as well. But partly it's because the system does not put life in the soil. It protects the soil and keeps it protected from certain conditions, but it can compact the soil. It can create a situation where you have soil that is not biologically alive. And where I first saw that was in Indiana, which was a real leader in no-till agriculture, and where they really started to see erosion on land they should not have been seeing erosion on. And so they really pursued trying to get farmers to put in cover crops, to get continuous living cover on that land between the cash crop growing seasons and build that soil health. But this is I took a photo of this billboard in southwest Iowa near where I grew up. It was put up by a co-op company there, West Central, which provides chemicals and fertilizer services for farmers. But this Justice von Liebig, he was the guy who really promoted this idea that instead of feeding the soil and building the soil, it was just a stand for that plant, and we should be feeding the plant. And it kind of saddens me to see that this idea is still out there. I mean, I think they mean well. They're trying to get that, sell a product to the farmer. But this idea that you're feeding the plant and not actually getting at the soil itself is really kind of one of the reasons we have a lot of problems right now and why a lot of farmers are seeking some alternatives in soil health. And this is just, again, when I was in Indiana, they are leaders in no-till. I mean, they have some great equipment. They're doing some great work out there. Purdue University has really promoted no-till, but they're really starting to see the downside to that system. They're realizing they have to integrate biological life into that system if it's going to be sustainable. So where I really learned the most about the soil health revolution and where a lot of people kind of credit this recent interest is in Burleigh County, North Dakota. And this is Jay Fear, who is an NRCS soil health guy out there who worked with a team of farmers, soil scientists, conservationists. And I really like this quote. He said, "We had accepted soil as a degraded resource, and we were putting in terraces and grassed waterways to try to just maintain a status quo. You know, and whenever you have low expectations of something, whether it be a resource or a person, they're going to live up to those low expectations." And they really felt like they could push and make that soil much better. And one of the reasons there is so much interest in soil health and why I really see a lot of potential for some of these bigger farmers to adapt some of these ecological practices from these kind of ecological agrarians is we are starting to see the economic benefits of this type of farming. And this is Dan Sutter, who farms several thousand acres in Indiana, and he has really been sold on the idea of building his soil health. And he was an investment banker for many years, and so he really looks at everything through the lens of economics. But he's hanging out with, in Indiana, they have purposely created these teams, they call them soil health teams, where they bring together conventional, large-scale farmers with some of these more ecologically minded farmers, plus they bring together seed dealers, implement dealers, because the implement dealers have the equipment that they can use to interseed cover crops, co-op fertilizer dealers, all these folks, they bring them together at field days and really try to get them, kind of do some cross-pollination where they really get these ideas going. And Dan is kind of the role he plays is he can really talk about the economics. And the prime example for him was he was doing no-till and he was doing a lot of corn and beans. He hadn't really done any cover cropping, but Purdue University had talked him into putting in like an acre of cover crops as just for some kind of a study. And he was digging out a tile line one day, and he noticed it was, I think in this case it was cereal rye was a cover crop, and it was doing something which I really like this term. It was biodrilling. It was sending roots down through the hard pan and breaking up the hard pan. And he kind of, because he's a numbers guy, he did a calculation in his head of how much money he was spending on fuel and wear and tear on his equipment to do deep tillage to try to break up that hard pan, and compared it to the price of planting cover crops, and it was no comparison. It was much cheaper to put in the cover crop. Plus, when you do cover crops for several years in a row, you can start to build that organic matter, and you can start to see savings in terms of you have to buy less fertilizer, your soil makes better use of your water, and you're going to get a yield boost during dry times. So he's really good at going around and talking about this one little thing that kind of drew him into building soil health and getting farmers interested. And it's almost like this gateway drug or gateway practice, we call it. Once you start planting one species of cover crops, then you want to do multiple species, and maybe you want to integrate grazing of livestock in there to build that organic matter. So I'm really excited about this whole area. And this is another, I guess, key part of this team that they have in Indiana. And I guess one thing the bottom line with Indiana, the reason I focused on it so much and the reason I went there is here in Iowa, we have maybe in a good year 3% of our land in cover crops. There's a lot of talk about cover crops, but frankly, the bottom line is we still only have about 3% of the land that's maybe put into cover crops. In Minnesota, we're worse. It's maybe 2%. In Indiana, it's 30%. So they have really gotten that land covered 365 days a year. And it's not just covered, but they've got living roots in that soil all year round. And one of the other key parts of these teams they've created in Indiana is people like Ray Weil, who's a soil ecologist from the University of Maryland, who I really like the way he communicates with farmers. He really gets them excited about this idea that they're all part of kind of this cutting edge area where the scientists are even kind of wondering what the next step is, and they're all kind of learning together. And I think that's a really good way to advance some of these practices. So this is Gabe Brown, who maybe a lot of you have heard of. If you've heard about the soil health revolution, he's talked about a lot. He's the guy from North Dakota. He just came out with a book, Dirt to Soil, which is really fun to read. And this is a 12-way mix of cover crops. I stood on top of a pickup truck and took a picture of him, and he was just about ready to turn his cattle in there and rotationally graze that. The way he would graze it is he would do mob grazing, where he would keep them in for a short period of time and then move them on. Half that vegetation wouldn't even be eaten. It would just be stomped into the soil. But he sees that as an investment in the future health of that soil.
What is it?
The mix?
Yeah.
He's got brassicas, grazing corn, sunflowers, rye. I can't tell you everything, but it's a real mix. And I was talking to Laura earlier. It's not just about throwing in a mix in there. He's good. He's one of these guys who has worked really specifically at looking at, as Laura would say, which species play well together. You know, which ones you can't just throw in anything because something's going to outcompete something else. They figured out how to do that. And he talks a lot about, I'm trying to mimic the prairie ecosystem when I'm doing this. You know, he's not going to have 100 species in there, but it's this idea that diversity can play off of these different species can play off of each other and can create this positive impact. And so, yeah, this quote is from Kristen Nichols, who's a soil microbiologist that worked with Gabe Brown and these other folks in North Dakota. And I really like this quote because she's really like, well, now what can we do? Because when she talked about when she was getting her PhD in soil science, she was told, well, we can't really raise organic matter levels in a typical lifetime. But she was seeing farmers do that. And so she had to kind of go back to the textbooks and go, oh, what is happening here? And, you know, they're able to raise their organic matter levels in 3 to 5 years. And they're seeing real impacts. This is just, again, this is from Martin and Loretta Jouse's farm. And I guess it's just another part of this idea of team effort. And a very important member of that team, which is eaters. And Kristen Hall, who's with the Audubon Society in Minnesota, had helped them put on a dinner on their farm to get these birders, these people who like birds, to connect the way their food's being produced with what kind of bird habitat is out there. And I think that's a really important connection. You know, like she says, you can't all buy a farm, but you can buy food. So you guys maybe recognize this. This is from the Prairie Strips research, and that I had a chance to go there when they were doing that research in their early years. And this is Pauline Drobny, a prairie scientist or ecologist, and this is Gary Van Rieswick. And this quote from Gary kind of gets at a lot of what I ran into with a lot of farmers who were interested in doing some of these kind of ecological methods, but weren't quite sure if maybe what the first steps were, or if even they needed to take those steps, which is often they don't know how much damage is being done and how much it's affecting themselves. And Gary didn't realize that. Gary was a no-tiller. He is a no-tiller in central Iowa. He didn't think he was losing that much soil until he got involved with this Prairie Strips research. And this was on his farm. That's no-till soybeans. And this was a lot of soil he was losing. And so he really, yes?
Just a note, Pauline has 2 degrees from you and I.
Oh, there you go. Well, there's something good there, huh? Yeah. So I think that's a really good, and that's another reason, another thing I really tried to emphasize in the book was the importance of these farmers being willing to work with scientists and with other teams to kind of learn, what is some of the impacts of some of these farming methods out there. And Gary, you know, because he was kind of a leader in the no-till movement, he was able then to kind of get the idea out there, and I think him and some other farmers really helped kind of popularize the use of these prairie strips out there, saying, you know, you're losing more soil than you realize out there. So this, I'm just going to talk about a few examples, and how much time do I have here? I want to leave a few minutes for questions if people have them. I'm just to point out a few examples of farmers who have integrated prairies into their farming systems. So this is Brooke and John Nicely, who have a CSA and an orchard in south central Minnesota. And they're again in the middle of corn and soybean country, and they have surrounded their farm with prairie, tall grass prairie system. And they, again, were an example of, they had environmental science degrees and from Bemidji State, and somehow got on a different route and went into farming. But they really, this is a typical quote that I would hear from a lot of these farmers, is the farm as an ecosystem. And they were really going to try to figure out a way to make a living on that farm by farming with nature kind of thing. But this was a prime example of a farm that really just makes you feel good to go there. It's a beautiful place. It smells good. The sounds are great. There's all these insects. They're able to make a living on a couple of acres there. But it is surrounded by corn and beans. And so what we need is more of these farms in these neighborhoods, and maybe kind of create kind of a contiguous situation to kind of get those wide-scale benefits. This is again Brian and Jesse Simon, and he talks about this idea that now that they have converted these corn and soybeans to this prairie ecosystem and have restored this oak savanna and are using this grazing system, there's no way they can go back. They feel like they've really, it's kind of a curse in a way. This is the way they're going to do it. And even if he's going to find, even if times it could be economically tough to do this sometimes and not the easiest way to do it, they're going to figure out a way to do it. And I think that these ecological agrarians, that's something I've found time after time, they are going to, no matter what the government programs are or the market situation is or the peer pressure is, they're going to figure out a way to do this. And I think that they can be a really good model for, again, these larger farmers who maybe the economic situation is even tougher for them. Well, what ideas can they borrow from these farms to kind of to bring more resilience into those bigger operations? And then we get these more wide-scale landscape level benefits. So Dan Jenigas is the guy that's quoted here, is this guy right here. Oops, and that's him again, but here we go. So this is Dan Jenigas. He farms in west central Minnesota. He raises beef and sheep. This is him at a BioBlitz. And this will be the last place in the world, I would imagine, ever finding Dan Jenigas at. So a BioBlitz is, in case you're not familiar, it's like a scavenger hunt. They'll have it in communities on a natural area in a park or a wildlife refuge, and they'll get people to come out, and they'll have experts on prairie plants or insects or birds lead these walks, and you'll kind of try to count up as many species as you can in a certain period of time. Well, this is on some Nature Conservancy land in west central Minnesota, and Dan farms near there, and he's really pissed off all the time about how he feels like the Nature Conservancy has all this land that he can't graze on. So he shows up at this BioBlitz, and he was on the prairie plant walk, and halfway through the prairie plant walk, the prairie ecologist who was leading it finally said, you know what, Dan, why don't you just lead this prairie plant walk? Because he knew the plants much better than anyone else. He knew every plant. And so I went up to him and I says, why do you know these plants so well? And he says, well, I should know them because I have a lot of them on my farm and I'm using them in my grazing system. And so he and some other farmers in that area worked with us, the Land Stewardship Project, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the NRCS to look at ways that we could, because this is a part of Minnesota that does have a fair amount of public lands and land that's been locked up by groups like the Nature Conservancy that's in natural habitat. And we were trying to figure out how could we extend the environmental benefits of these public lands and these Nature Conservancy lands across more of the landscape. And one of the things we did was we talked to, there was a lot of animosity between the farmers and the environmental community there, but we brought them together at meetings and we said, well, what is it that we can agree on? And both groups said, you know, nothing against corn and soybeans, but there's too much of it out here. We both would like to see more grass. Now the farmers wanted it and the ranchers wanted it for different reasons than the environmentalists. They wanted it for the feed value, and the environmentalists wanted it for the wildlife habitat and the water quality benefits. But that's enough of an area to kind of where they could kind of agree on something. So as a result, we worked with people like Dan and the Blair family, this is on the Blair family's farm here, to help them do some prairie restoration on lands that had been in corn and beans. And these were people who, now this is key, there still is a beef grazing or beef production population in this area. They haven't lost that. So there is still these core of farmers who are looking for grazing lands. But we were able to bring them together. And this land here, you can't really tell from this, but so you see that this is the, up there, this is called Glacial Till region in west central Minnesota. It's extremely erosive. And so this land, there's all these hullocks around here, and this was all in corn and soybeans 4 years prior to this prairie planting. The erosion was horrendous. It changed hands. This Blair family was able to buy this land, and the Fish and Wildlife Service came in and said, what if we helped you restore this to prairie and set up a rotational grazing system? The Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife Service happens to have land across the road, and they wanted to see some benefits, you know, kind of cross those public-private boundaries. And so they got this, and one of the things that they were able to do was people like Dan Genicas, who had a lot of experience planting cover crops, because he also raises corn and beans, they used the cover crops to really kind of supercharge the biology in that soil as they were preparing it to make that transition from corn and soybeans to prairie. Dan did the same thing on his farm. He was able to introduce some native species into part of his farm. And the benefits, there's multiple benefits to this, and one of it is the Fish and Wildlife Service and Nature Conservancy, they get these environmental benefits, like I said, going beyond the boundaries of their land. But also the farmers get a benefit of the Fish and Wildlife Service and Nature Conservancy, when they see that they're good at doing conservation grazing, will allow them to bring their cattle in and control invasive species on these natural habitats. And that then takes pressure off of those pastures on those farms, and habitat and wildlife habitat and water quality benefits can result from that. So this is on the Blair farm, and this is Steve Chaplin, who is a scientist with Nature Conservancy, who's worked on this effort out there. He really, I think this quote really gets across this idea that when you have these public lands managed well, we can have a wider landscape level impact when it's a mixture of the private and public lands. And really talking about this overall landscape and not just a particular piece of ground. So this is the Blair farm, and again, this is the kind of habitat. Oops, and I shut it off. I do.
Oh, you may have muted it.
Oh.
Try the unmute.
Uh-oh. Now I really did it.
There we
Oh,
go.
here we go.
There we go. That should go away. It must just be touchy.
Well, I'm not really slick with it. Anyway, this is again this, and the Fish and Wildlife Service really likes showing off this plan because it took off so well. So here's the deal: these cattle, they rotationally graze them through. They're not getting the highest production out of that. You know, it's not as good as if you had a good old pasture, domesticated pasture. But in west central Minnesota, they have a lot of problems with what they call summer slump, where these cool season pastures, you know, they do great up until you get into the midsummer heat, and then they go into a a real funk, and then farmers often end up either overgrazing them and doing a lot of damage to them, or they buy hay. It can be very expensive. These farmers that are integrating these prairie systems into their grazing regime are able to kind of get through that. And again, it's not the highest production, but it's a nice sine wave. They're getting a kind of production all through the summer, and it saves them a lot of money. That they're able to not buy hay and also not have to damage their pastures so much. That's it. So one thing, Laura had mentioned this podcast. So the landstewardshipproject.org is our website. And we have actually, one thing if you may be interested in, we have a page on that called the Soil Builders page, which has a lot of soil health information on there. We've created teams of soil hubs across southern Minnesota of farmers and scientists that are doing some of these things. But my website, badevore.com, I have on that page podcasts that I've done that features a lot of the farmers that are featured in this book. So you may be interested in that. Thanks a lot.
Some of you may need to take off, but there is time for questions and conversation.
Oh, yes.
It's kind of interesting, that last shot, I was just thinking as I talked about it, we went so much to cool season grazing that we eliminated the midsummer grazing stuff, and now we're coming back to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's this idea that, and I see this too with a lot of the farmers who are doing soil health practices in general. You may not get the highest yields, but you're getting maybe more profitable yields. And it's the same with the grazing. If you're able to get that constant grazing throughout the season. And the example in soil health that I saw was farmers in Indiana talking about when they use cover crops to replace a lot of the purchase fertility, they don't get the highest jolts in fertility like you would with adding nitrogen, but it's more of this constant sine wave kind of effect. And that can help you, and they find that when you do build up that organic matter level, that you're more resilient in times of really extreme weather. And so you're able to get decent yields, profitable yields, when it maybe nobody else is. But you may not get the highest yields, but it's more of a profitable yield, if that makes sense. Yes?
Well, the fellow that was pasturing the timber, did he replant that or reseed it? And my second question is, what state is beaver in?
Beaver, Minnesota. Yeah, it's in southeast Minnesota. So he did do some seeding in there, yes. And I don't know what species he was using, but he did.
Well, you said he had alleys. How wide is an alley for trees?
So I'm thinking he was doing about 30-foot wide alleys in there. Yeah, yeah. He's modified that system since I took that picture, and he's now looking at different species to put in there that aren't so attractive to gophers. Turns out red oak, they really like red oak. Yes?
So the photo of Dan and his cover crop cocktail that he put in after the corn before the prairie, something I've been thinking about for several years. And you talk to a lot of long-time prairie restorationists, and they'll say, it's great to go in after corn. It's great. There's nothing to fix. And yet, I keep wondering about that, what he's doing. I mean, it's time for research about whether or not you should make that second step.
Yeah.
And why is he doing it just because it sounds cool, or why?
We
don't know.
Yeah.
We need to know, does it do something instead of just going from the corn to the seed mix?
Well, that's a good question. So there's two reasons he's doing it. He believes that it's helping supercharge that biological activity in the soil.
Because that's the Burleigh County.
Yeah, that's the Burleigh County idea.
Priming.
But the other reason is he could get economic value out of it because he's got cattle handy that he can graze those cover crops on, and so it worked with his system. If he didn't have livestock and he was just going straight into prairie,
some point, you have to put the prairie in, and it's gonna take a couple years to put the cows back in
Yes.
there.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, so he does lose that economic value right there.
One way or another, you do skip a year or two.
Yeah. Don't know. It's a good question. There's a couple of farmers out in that area doing it that way, mostly because Dan did it and it worked for him. Yes.
What were some really neat things that stuck out to you when you visited the CSA farms or the vegetable, kind of bigger scale vegetable farms around here in the Midwest?
I think, well, more and more of them are using cover crops in ways that, because almost none of them are going to have livestock where they're able to add value to those cover crops by grazing them. So they really have to look at, well, what benefits do the cover crops provide just the soil biology itself. So there's actually, it's surprising, not all of them used cover crops in the old days. You know, it was a lot of tillage and a lot of bare ground. So that was neat. I tell you, the Landgraf, Tim Landgraf and Jan Libby, they had set up a system. It was almost like a version of this alley grazing system where it's a very windy area, there's a lot of soil erosion, and they're on kind of actually in an area that's very flat, but then they're up on a kind of a rise. They had put in windbreaks kind of in an alley system and then had their vegetable gardens in between there. And what they were also doing with that was they would then periodically, they raised chickens as well, and we're selling meat chickens. They would go in and move those through, sometimes after planting a cover crop, and graze those through those in kind of an alley type system. So that was kind of neat, the way they did that.
Were the windbreaks going east and west, or were they going north and south?
They were east and west.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
And then those guys' farms were,
That was one step at a time gardens.
okay.
Yeah, they have a lot of field days, and they're real involved with Practical Farmers of Iowa.
Okay. Thank you.
And they've done a lot of pollinator habitat as well, a lot of research on pollinators. Oh, yes.
So my question probably doesn't apply because it's very difficult to do ecosystem. We're growing perennials surrounded by corn and soy. And I'm wondering, my question is, do cover crops help if you're working with perennial plants, or do the cover crops take away from the plants that the perennials that you're trying to grow? And have you worked with anybody who works with perennials rather than annual crops?
So works with perennials in what, like what?
Well, the debate I have with my partner is if he wants me to weed all around so there's a path to walk, and I'm like, well, wouldn't it help if we have some plants in between? And he's, well, no, not really, because it's going to rob the nutrients.
It's going to rob the
away
nutrients,
from
yeah.
the perennial plants.
Yeah,
And I don't know if he's right or not.
yeah.
And then I don't know if there are other ideas beyond cover crops to make a better ecology than we have, because we're kind of like corn and soy, we just have a different perennial.
Yeah,
plant, you know?
yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out ways to be more ecologically
Yeah.
sustainable, given.
That's a good question. I don't know the
Yeah,
answer
but
to it.
what-
Any thoughts on that?
We use what we call a nurse crop, sometimes on sloping ground. We'll plant wheat or oats in with the prairie plants,
Mhm.
and they tend to germinate quickly and provide some structure and prevent some soil erosion. And one of the biggest problems with prairie plantings is the seeds are so tiny and they're planted so close to the surface that if you get a heavy rain, the seeds can all end up at the bottom of the hill under an inch of soil. Or even if they're under a half an inch of soil or a quarter of an inch, it varies them too much.
Yeah.
So soil movement in the beginning of a prairie planting is really bad. And so sometimes these nurse crops will help with that. So this is a little different idea than nurse crop, I think. This is sort of a pre-plant. They're planting it to maybe they have more soil texture, compaction, structure issues, which anytime you have tiny seeds you're putting in the ground, that soil structure is important for getting the water and to the seedlings.
Yeah, that is a good point. What a lot of these farmers are using are what they call tillage radish. That sends. Have you ever seen these pictures of these people with the tillage? These huge tap roots that, again, do that bile drilling to break that compaction. I mean, because I showed a picture of Ray Weil in a soil trench. So he told me stories of being in soil trenches where, and this is a really important part of these field days because it's to get into farmers' minds this idea that it's not just about what's above the surface, but what's below these root systems. But Ray told me stories of being in soil trenches in a cornfield, and you'd see the corn root go down, hit the hard pan, and take a 90-degree, trying to get through that. And so, that hard pan is no joke. And so that may be one of what they're trying to do with some of these cover crops is really break that up, get that hard pan broken up.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of these prairies, do they ever burn them, or is it mostly controlled with grazing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one of the reasons the Fish and Wildlife Service is interested in having these farmers do rotational grazing on their land, and the Nature Conservancy as well, is they're having a harder and harder time burning. There's like pushback in the community, the weather conditions always have to be just right, that kind of thing. So it's not a replacement for burning, but they're starting to see the use of using livestock. On these private lands where they've got livestock, they never burn. They're going to use the cattle to try to do that. I don't know the science enough behind it. Like, there's probably benefits to burning that you don't see with rotational grazing and vice versa. But I'm hearing more and more it's such a hassle to get into some of these areas and burn. What's that?
Said rent a goat.
Rent a goat, yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and thank
Thank you.
Brian